Blood shouldn't smell like rust and crushed lavender. That was Josiah's first thought when he kicked open the gear closet at the trading post, expecting to find a stack of canvas tarps. Instead, he found her. Gagged with a filthy feed sack, wrists chafed raw against hemp rope, her eyes wide like a trapped doe's in the lantern light. He had just come down from the high country for a box of cartridges and a new repeating rifle. He wasn't looking to buy trouble. Trouble, it seemed, was already waiting in the dark. Wind howled down through the jagged teeth of the bitter roots, carrying the sharp, sterile scent of impending snow. Josiah tasted it on the back of his tongue, a metallic cold that meant the high passes would be sealed in ice within the week. He rode a sway-backed mule named Barnaby, leading a second pack mule laden with 6 months of prime beaver pelts. Josiah hadn't spoken a word to another human being since April. The silence of the mountains had settled into his bones, a heavy, comfortable ache. Down here, in the valley, the air felt thick. It smelled of decay, of cattle dung, and the sour sweat of desperate men. The settlement was barely a scar on the prairie. 6 wooden buildings huddled together as if bracing against the endless wind. At the end of the rutted dirt street sat Hiram's goods and munitions. Josiah dismounted. His knees popped, stiff from the cold and the altitude. He tied the mules to the hitching post, his thick, calloused fingers moving with deliberate slowness. He didn't look at the few ragged townsfolk who paused on the boardwalk to stare at him. To them, he was a ghost draped in grease-blackened buckskin and a heavy buffalo coat. His beard was a tangled thicket. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of a slouch hat, were pale and flat. He pushed open the heavy timber door of the trading post. The hinges screamed, a shrill scrape of rusted iron that made the hair on Josiah's arms stand up. Inside, the air was suffocating. It held a dense, layered funk. Pickled eggs fermenting in a cloudy jar, spilled kerosene, stale chewing tobacco, and the dusty, dry rot smell of old canvas. Dust motes danced lazily in the single shaft of sunlight, piercing the grimy front window. Hiram stood behind the heavy oak counter. The man was a rat in human clothing, possessing a narrow, twitchy face and hair slicked flat with cheap pomade. He was wiping down the wood with a dirty rag, but his hand stopped moving when Josiah stepped into the gloom. "Josiah," Hiram said. His voice was too loud, strained. It broke the heavy silence of the store like a snapped twig. "Didn't expect to see you down from the timber this side of spring." "Snow's coming early," Josiah rasped. His own voice sounded foreign to him, gravelly and harsh from disuse. He walked to the counter, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He tossed a heavy leather satchel onto the wood. It hit with a dull, heavy thud. "Pelts. Prime. Need salt, coffee, flour, and a rifle." Hiram eyed the satchel, but his gaze kept darting toward the heavy curtain that separated the storefront from the back storeroom. The man was sweating. Beads of moisture gathered on his upper lip despite the drafty chill in the room. "Rifle," Hiram repeated, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Got a few Springfields left over from the war. A Henry repeater. But the action sticks." "I wrote you a letter in May," Josiah said, his voice flat, dangerously quiet. "Told you to hold a Winchester Model 1873, 44-40, and 400 rounds." Hiram swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Right. Right, the Winchester. It's back there. Just got to dig it out of the crates." Josiah watched him. A knot of unease began to tighten in his gut. Men out here were usually nervous, but Hiram looked like a man standing on the gallows. And there was something else. A smell cutting through the kerosene and tobacco spit. Lavender. It was faint, but distinct. Expensive lye soap. Out here, women smelled of wood smoke and lye, same as the men. Nobody smelled of blooming lavender unless they were passing through on the stagecoach. Thump! A muffled sound came from behind the heavy canvas curtain. A dull, heavy shift of weight. Hiram flinched. He forced a sickeningly wide smile, revealing yellowed teeth. Rats! Big bastards down in the cellar. I'll go fetch that rifle, Josiah. You wait right here. Hiram practically bolted for the curtain, but Josiah's hand shot out. His thick fingers closed around Hiram's wrist. The proprietor's bones felt fragile, like bird bones beneath Josiah's grip. Rats don't wear boots, Hiram, Josiah said softly. He didn't wait for an answer. He shoved Hiram aside. The man stumbled, crashing into a barrel of pickled pork. Josiah swept the curtain back, stepping into the dim, cluttered hallway that led to the storeroom. The scent of lavender grew stronger, now mingled with the unmistakable, coppery stench of fresh blood. The back room was a chaotic mess of overstock. Crates of iron nails, stacks of moth-eaten wool blankets, and saddles hung over sawhorses. The single window was boarded up, letting only thin slivers of grey light slice through the gloom. Josiah stood perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust, letting his ears do the work. The wind rattled the walls outside, but beneath that, he heard it. Breathing. Fast, shallow, panicked intakes of air. It was coming from the heavy wooden gear closet, tucked into the darkest corner of the room. A rusted padlock hung open on the hasp. Someone had been in a hurry. Josiah felt the familiar, cold prickle of adrenaline at the base of his skull. His hand drifted instinctively to the heavy bone-handled knife sheathed at his hip. He didn't draw it. Not yet. He stood there, wrestling with an overwhelming urge to turn around. Walk away. That was the first rule of living long in the high country. Never stick your hands in a hole if you don't know what's biting inside. Whatever Hiram had gotten himself into, it wasn't a mountain man's business. Let the valley eat itself. But the smell of blood was heavy, fresh. With a low curse, Josiah stepped forward. He didn't throw the door open heroically. He stood to the side, pressing his back against the rough-hewn wall, and kicked the latch with the heel of his boot. The door swung outward with a squeal. Josiah raised his revolver, his thumb cocking the hammer back in a single fluid motion. The sharp clack, clack of the cylinder turning echoed in the small space. He peered inside. It wasn't a man with a gun. She was crammed between two sacks of oats, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She wore a traveling dress of dark green wool, but it was torn at the shoulder, covered in pale dust. Her wrists were bound in front of her with thick hemp rope, the fibers biting deep into her skin, leaving raw, weeping abrasions. A filthy, grain-dusted burlap sack was tied tightly through her mouth as a gag, but it was her eyes that stopped Josiah cold. They weren't pleading. They were wild, feral, burning with a frantic, cornered fury. A deep gash tracked down the side of her temple, matting her dark hair with a sticky crust of blackening blood. Josiah exhaled slowly. He lowered the hammer of his revolver, letting it rest safely, and slid the iron back into its holster. "Damn it," he whispered. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He just stood there, his mind racing through the brutal mathematics of survival. A woman, bound in a closet. Hiram was either holding her for ransom or selling her to the highest bidder in the silver camps down south. Taking her meant taking on whoever paid Hiram. It meant slowing down. It meant a target on his back when he should be halfway up the timberline. She shrank back as he stepped into the doorway, her boots kicking uselessly against the floorboards. She let out a muffled scream through the gag. To her, he was just another monster in the dark, a massive, bearded brute smelling of animal fat and pine resin. "Hold still," Josiah grunted. He reached out. She thrashed, turning her head violently and throwing her bound hands up to block him. Her nails, though broken and dirty, scraped across his knuckles. I said, "Hold still," he growled, grabbing her wrists with one massive hand. He pinned her arms down, ignoring her frantic struggles. With his other hand, he reached behind her head, finding the knot of the gag. It was tied tight, soaked with sweat and spit. His thick fingers, numb from the cold ride, struggled with the rigid cloth. Frustrated, he drew his skinning knife. She went perfectly rigid, her eyes tracking the gleaming steel, wide with absolute terror. "Don't move," he commanded softly. He slipped the blade flat against her cheek, feeling the heat of her skin, the rapid thumping of the pulse in her neck. With a flick of his wrist, he severed the knot. She spat the foul cloth out instantly, gasping for air, her chest heaving. She didn't thank him. Instead, she scrambled backward, pressing herself harder against the wall. "Who are you?" she rasped. Her voice was shredded, dry as a bone. "Nobody," Josiah said. He reached for her bound wrists. She jerked them away. "Don't touch me." "Suit yourself," Josiah said flatly. He stood up, wiping his knife on his buckskins. "You can wait for Hiram to come back and finish whatever deal he's making." He turned his back on her, fully prepared to walk out. It wasn't a bluff. He had a harsh winter ahead of him, and playing savior was a rich man's game. He heard the rustle of wool, the scrape of boots on wood. "Wait," she croaked. Josiah paused. He looked over his shoulder. She held her bound wrists out toward him, her hands trembling violently, though whether from fear, cold, or rage, he couldn't tell. Her jaw was set. He knelt back down. He took her hands in his. Her skin was freezing. He wedged the blade beneath the thick hemp, turning the sharp edge upward to avoid cutting her wrists. He saw the deep purple bruising around the rope burns. Someone had enjoyed tying this tight. He sliced upward. The tension broke, the rope snapping back. She gasped, pulling her hands to her chest, rubbing the raw, bleeding skin. "Can you walk?" Josiah asked, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. "I don't know," she said, her breathing still ragged. "My legs are numb. Figure it out fast, because Hiram is likely fetching a scattergun." Josiah stood up, stepping out of the closet. He scanned the crates until he saw a long, rectangular wooden box pushed beneath a pile of canvas. Stenciled on the side, Winchester Repeating Arms Co. He dragged the heavy box out, grabbed an iron crowbar resting on a barrel, and jammed it under the lid. Wood splintered. Nails shrieked as they gave way. He threw the lid aside. Inside, nestled in oiled paper, was the 1873 Winchester. He pulled it out. The heavy, blued steel felt right in his hands, a perfectly balanced tool of destruction. He tossed aside the paper and grabbed a handful of brass cartridges from a smaller box inside the crate. He began feeding them into the loading gate with practiced, rhythmic clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He didn't notice the shadow in the doorway until the floorboards groaned. "Drop it, Josiah." The voice was shaky, pitching high with panic. Josiah didn't turn around. He didn't freeze. He just let out a long, slow breath. The acrid smell of fear sweat filled the room, overpowering the lavender entirely. "You're making a mistake, Hiram," Josiah said, his voice calm, heavy as stone. He held the Winchester low, his thumb resting near the hammer. "I said drop it!" Hiram screamed. Josiah turned slowly. Hiram stood in the threshold, a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun trembling against his shoulder. The twin muzzles looked like two black tunnels pointing straight at Josiah's chest. Behind Hiram, the pale afternoon light from the storefront framed him. The man was terrified. Terrified men with triggers were the most dangerous animals on earth. "She wasn't meant for you," Hiram stammered, sweat dripping down his narrow nose. "She's cargo, paid for. You just..." You just walk out, Josiah. Take the rifle. Take your supplies. On the house. Just walk out. Josiah glanced toward the closet. The woman, he didn't even know her name, was trying to stand, using the wall for support. Her face was pale, a ghost haunting the shadows. She looked at him. She expected him to leave her. He could see it in the hard set of her mouth, the bitter acceptance in her eyes. The men in her life had probably always left her, or worse. Josiah looked back at Hiram. Who bought her? Don't matter, Hiram yelled. Men you don't cross. Men you don't even look at. Josiah weighed the heavy Winchester in his hands. He could take the rifle, walk out, be back up the mountain by nightfall. Safe, warm, mind his own business. Instead, Josiah sighed. It was a tired, weary sound. I need my coffee, Hiram. Josiah didn't raise the rifle. He didn't try to quick draw. Instead, with a sudden, violent burst of speed that belied his massive size, he kicked the heavy oak crate holding the rifle stock directly at Hiram's shins. The heavy wood slammed into Hiram's legs. The proprietor shrieked, stumbling backward. The shotgun went off. Boom! The noise in the enclosed room was deafening. A physical pressure that punched Josiah in the chest. A cloud of thick, grey sulfur smoke blinded him instantly. Buckshot tore into the ceiling above him, raining down a hail of splintered wood, plaster, and ancient dust. His ears rang with a high, sustained whine. Josiah dropped low beneath the smoke, lunging forward. He collided with Hiram's waist before the man could pull the second trigger. They crashed into the hallway, knocking over a shelf of tin plates that cascaded down on them with an unbearable clatter. Hiram was flailing, screaming, trying to bring the long barrels of the shotgun down to bear on Josiah's back. Josiah didn't bother with technique or form. He fought like a grizzly in a trap. He drove his elbow up, smashing blindly into Hiram's face. He felt the sickening crunch of cartilage. Hiram wailed, blood spraying from his ruined nose across Josiah's buckskins. But Hiram, fueled by absolute terror, kicked wildly, his boot catching Josiah squarely in the ribs. The wind left Josiah's lungs in a rush. He rolled off, gasping, tasting dust and blood. Hiram scrambled away, crying, trying to rack the action on his shotgun or reach for a sidearm. Josiah didn't give him the chance. He grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet hanging from a nail on the wall beside him. He swung it in a brutal, horizontal arc. Iron met skull with a dull, wet thwack. Hiram's eyes rolled back into his head. He crumpled instantly, folding like a sack of wet laundry against the baseboards, entirely limp. The trading post was suddenly, violently silent, save for the ringing in Josiah's ears and the rapid, wheezing sound of his own breath. The air was thick with the biting smell of black powder and pulverized wood. Josiah pushed himself to his knees, spitting a glob of blood onto the floorboards. His ribs burned. He pressed a hand against his side, wincing. Nothing broken, just cracked. He looked up. The woman was standing in the doorway of the storeroom. She had picked up Hiram's fallen shotgun. It was too heavy for her, the barrels trembling as she pointed it down at Hiram's unconscious body, her finger resting nervously on the trigger. Her hands were still bleeding, smearing crimson on the wooden stock. Josiah slowly stood, raising a hand. He's done. Put it down. She didn't lower the gun immediately. She looked from Hiram's bleeding face to Josiah. Her breathing was ragged. Is he dead? No, Josiah grunted, picking up his slouch hat and dusting it off. But he will be when whoever bought you finds out he let you slip. What's your name? She hesitated, her jaw working. Maeve. All right, Maeve. Josiah stepped past her into the storeroom, grabbing the Winchester and the box of cartridges. He slung his satchel of pelts over his shoulder. Grab a coat, thickest wool you can find in there. Boots if he has your size. We got about 10 minutes before the gunshot brings the town marshal, or worse. Maeve lowered the shotgun, the adrenaline clearly wearing off, leaving her shaking. You're taking me with you?" Josiah stopped and looked at her. He took in her torn dress, her bruised wrists, the dried blood on her temple. She was dead weight. She would slow him down. She would eat his rations. She would bring killers to his camp. It was the worst decision he could possibly make. "Unless you'd rather wait here for his business partners," Josiah said coldly, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I'm going up the mountain. It's 30 below at the summit. You keep up or you freeze. Your choice." He didn't wait to see if she followed. He pushed through the canvas curtain, stepping over Hiram's bleeding body, and walked out into the dusty storefront. He grabbed 2 sacks of coffee beans, a slab of salt pork, and a tin of matches, tossing a gold eagle coin onto the blood-stained counter. When he stepped out the front door, the wind hit him like a physical blow, colder now, carrying the first, stinging flakes of snow. A moment later, the heavy timber door shrieked open again. Maeve stepped out. She had draped a massive, oversized buffalo hide coat over her shoulders, her hands clutching the collar tight. She looked tiny. She looked terrified. But she was walking. Josiah untied the mules. He handed her the reins to Barnaby. "Mount up," he said, turning his face toward the jagged grey peaks looming in the distance. The storm was coming, and so, he knew, were the men who owned the trading post. He swung up onto his own saddle, the new Winchester resting across his thighs, the cold metal biting through his trousers. He didn't look back at the town. He just clicked his tongue, and the mules began the slow, brutal ascent into the freezing dark. The cold was a physical thing. It didn't just chill the skin, it chewed at the joints and settled into the marrow. By the time they hit the timberline, the snow was falling in dense, heavy curtains, turning the world into a blinding grey smear. Josiah rode ahead, his chin tucked deep into the collar of his buffalo coat. He didn't look back. He listened. The rhythmic crunch of Barnaby's hooves in the accumulating snow told him Maeve was still there. The occasional sharp intake of breath told him she was suffering. The trail here wasn't a trail at all. It was a goat path tracing the spine of a jagged ridge, bordered on the left by a sheer drop into a canyon choked with black pines. The wind shrieked through the rock formations, a high, mechanical whistle that grated against the eardrums. Josiah's beard was frozen solid, caked with frost from his own breath. He was angry. He was angry at the weather, angry at Hiram, but mostly he was angry at himself. A man alone in this weather had a chance. A man dragging a half-frozen, battered woman on a tired mule was begging for a shallow grave in the permafrost. He pulled back on the reins. His mule, a scarred, foul-tempered beast he called Jumper, snorted out a plume of white steam and halted. Barnaby stopped a few paces behind. Josiah twisted in his saddle. Maeve was slumped forward, her arms wrapped around the mule's neck. The oversized wool coat swallowed her. But it wasn't enough. She was shivering so violently that the saddle leathers squeaked with every tremor. Her face, framed by the dark collar, was the color of old parchment. The gash on her temple had stopped bleeding, sealed by the freezing air into a black, jagged crust. "Don't go to sleep!" Josiah yelled over the wind. His voice was rough, scraping his throat. Maeve lifted her head. Her eyes were dull, unfocused. Her lips were cracked and bruised a pale blue. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, looking right through him. Josiah cursed under his breath, a sharp, bitter string of words lost to the gale. He dismounted. His boots sank ankle-deep into the powder. He trudged back to Barnaby and grabbed the mule's bridle, leading the animal by hand. "Half a mile," Josiah grunted, not looking at her. "There's a cut in the rock, sheltered. You fall off now. I'm leaving you for the wolves." It was a lie, but only barely. They pushed upward. The incline steepened. Josiah's lungs burned, begging for oxygen in the thin air. His thighs ached with the effort of breaking trail through the drifts. He kept his eyes locked on the faint impressions of the terrain, feeling his way to the overhang from pure, muscle-deep memory. The shelter was a shallow gouge in the granite face, roofed by an outcrop of stone that kept the worst of the snow at bay. The ground beneath was dry, composed of loose shale and ancient desiccated pine needles. Josiah dragged the mules under the overhang. The sudden cessation of the wind was shocking. The silence in the cave felt heavy, pressing in on his eardrums. He turned to Maeve. She hadn't moved. She was still clinging to Barnaby's neck, her knuckles white. "Get down," he said. She didn't react. Josiah stepped closer. He smelled wet wool, the sour tang of old fear, and underneath it, the faint, persistent ghost of that lavender soap. He reached up, grasping her waist through the thick coat. She flinched violently, a sudden, ragged gasp tearing from her throat. She tried to scramble backward over the mule's rump, her boots kicking wildly. "Easy," Josiah barked, stepping back, holding his hands up. "Just getting you off the damn mule. You're frozen to the saddle." Maeve blinked rapidly, the panic in her eyes slowly giving way to painful awareness. She looked down at her hands, then at the rocky floor. She tried to swing her leg over the pommel, but her muscles refused to obey. She slid sideways, losing her balance. Josiah caught her before she hit the shale. She felt weightless, fragile. He didn't hold her any longer than necessary, setting her roughly on her feet against the stone wall. Her knees buckled immediately. She slid down the granite face until she was sitting in the dirt, her arms wrapped tightly around her shins. Josiah ignored her. Survival meant prioritizing the heat. He moved to the pack mule, his frozen fingers fumbling with the stiff canvas straps. He pulled out a bundle of fat wood he kept wrapped in an oilskin tarp, then gathered a handful of the dry pine needles from the cave floor. He knelt a few feet from Maeve. He struck his flint against a piece of hardened steel. Clack, clack. Sparks cascaded down. On the third strike, a tiny ribbon of smoke curled upward. He blew on it gently, coaxing a fragile yellow flame to life. He fed it splinters of fat wood, the resin catching with a sharp, hissing crackle. The smell of burning pine filled the small space, pushing back the sterile scent of the storm. Josiah added thicker branches, building a solid, roaring fire that cast dancing orange shadows against the grey stone. Only then did he look at her. Maeve was staring at the flames, her teeth clicking together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. "Move closer," Josiah said. She shook her head, a barely perceptible motion. Josiah sighed. He stood up, grabbed her by the thick collar of the coat, and dragged her 3 feet across the shale until she was sitting close enough to feel the heat. He didn't do it gently. He went back to the mules, pulling down the heavy saddlebags, a cast-iron pot, and the tin of coffee he'd bought from Hiram's counter in another lifetime. Water from a canteen, a handful of coarse black coffee grounds thrown directly into the boiling pot. It was mountain coffee, thick enough to tar a roof and strong enough to jump-start a corpse. Josiah poured the scalding sludge into a battered tin cup. He wrapped a rag around the hot metal handle and held it out to Maeve. She looked at the cup, then up at him. The firelight caught the harsh angles of her face, highlighting the dirt, the dried blood, and the deep, exhausted hollows beneath her eyes. "Drink it," Josiah said. "It'll thaw your guts." She reached out. Her hands were still trembling so badly she couldn't grip the handle. Josiah didn't offer to hold it for her. He just watched, his face impassive, as she clamped both of her raw, rope-burned hands around the hot tin, letting it burn her skin for the sake of the warmth. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. She coughed instantly, the bitter liquid burning her throat. But she didn't put it down. Josiah poured himself a cup and squatted across the fire from her. He pulled off his hat, running a hand through his matted hair. The ice in his beard was beginning to melt, dripping down his canvas shirt. For a long time, the only sounds were the howling of the wind outside the cave and the popping of the pitch in the fire. "Why didn't you leave me?" Her voice was a rasp, broken and quiet. Josiah looked at her over the rim of his cup. He took a slow swallow of the boiling coffee, letting it scald all the way down. "Don't know," he said honestly. "Stupidity, mostly." Maeve let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "At least you don't lie. Lying takes effort." Josiah set his cup down on a flat rock. He reached to his belt and unbuttoned a small leather pouch, pulling out a tin of axle grease and a clean strip of white cotton he usually used for gun wadding. "Let me see your hands." Maeve pulled her cup closer to her chest. "They're fine. They're bleeding," Josiah corrected, his voice flat. "Tomorrow they'll fester. By Tuesday your fingers will turn black. I'm not amputating hands on this mountain. Give them here." She stared at him, her jaw tight. The mistrust radiated off her in waves, thick and palpable as the smoke. But she was smart enough to know he was right. Slowly, she extended her hands over the fire. The wrists were a mess of torn skin and bruised tissue, rubbed raw by the hemp rope. Josiah didn't touch her skin directly. He used the cotton rag to wipe away the dirt and dried blood. She hissed through her teeth as the rough cloth dragged over the open wounds. "Who did Hiram sell you to?" Josiah asked, his eyes focused entirely on his work. He scooped a dollop of the yellow axle grease onto his thumb and smeared it thick over the rope burns. It wasn't medicine, but it would seal the broken skin against the cold and the dirt. "A man named Silas," she whispered. Josiah paused. His thumb hovered over a deep cut on her left wrist. The fire popped loudly. "Silas," Josiah repeated, the name tasting sour in his mouth. Silas wasn't just a man. Silas ran the cattle rustling and the mining camps south of the Bitterroots. He collected things: horses, guns, debts, women. "You owe him." "My husband did," Maeve said. Her voice went entirely dead, devoid of any inflection. "He played faro, drank sour mash, borrowed money from men who don't forgive. When he couldn't pay," she stopped. She didn't need to finish. "Where is your husband now?" Josiah asked, tearing the cotton strip in half to wrap her wrists. "In the ground," Maeve said coldly. "Silas's men shot him in the street. Then they came to the house for me. Said a debt is a debt." Josiah tied the bandage tight, pinning the end under itself. "They dragged you to Hiram's. Hiram was holding me until Silas sent a wagon up from the valley." Maeve pulled her hands back, cradling them against her stomach. "You just robbed a very dangerous man." Josiah picked up his coffee cup. He looked out into the swirling white void beyond the cave entrance. The snow was falling harder now, erasing the tracks they had left, burying the mountain in silence. "I bought a Winchester, coffee, and salt pork," Josiah said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You were just clutter in the storeroom. Silas wants to bleed over it. He can climb the mountain." He stood up, walking to his saddlebags. He pulled out a heavy wool blanket, smelling strongly of horse sweat and dust. He walked back and dropped it on top of her. "Sleep," he ordered. "Fire dies in 3 hours, and I'm not waking up to rebuild it. We move at first light." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked to the back of the shallow cave, pulled his coat tight around himself, and lay down on the hard shale, tipping his hat over his eyes. He didn't sleep. He kept one hand resting on the heavy, bone-handled knife at his belt, listening to the erratic, shallow rhythm of Maeve's breathing, until it finally smoothed out into exhaustion. The morning broke with a violent brilliance. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving the sky a shocking, bruised blue. The sun glared off the fresh snow, blindingly bright, turning the mountain into a landscape of shattered diamonds and deep, blue-black shadows. Josiah was awake before the sun crested the ridge. The fire was dead. Nothing but cold, grey ash. The air in the cave was so cold it hurt to breathe, the moisture in his nose freezing instantly with every inhalation. He sat up, his joints cracking like dry twigs. He looked over at the fire pit. Maeve was sitting up, the wool blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. She was watching him. She looked terrible. Her skin sallow, her lips chapped, the bandage on her wrists stained with yellow grease and fresh, dark spots of blood. But she was awake. "Mount up," Josiah said, standing and shaking the frost from his coat. He didn't make coffee. He didn't offer her food. The cold was a ticking clock. If they didn't get moving, their blood would slow down and stop. He walked to the edge of the overhang and looked down the trail they had climbed yesterday. The snow was deep, pristine, untouched. The wind had filled in their tracks entirely. To anyone in the valley, they were ghosts. Josiah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a brass spyglass. He extended it with a metallic shh and raised it to his eye, scanning the timberline far below. He swept the glass over the tops of the black pines, searching the breaks in the trees. Nothing. Just white, unbroken desolation. He lowered the glass, feeling a fraction of the tension release from his shoulders. Maybe the storm had grounded them. Maybe Silas's men had decided a woman wasn't worth freezing to death over. Then he saw it. Not movement, color, a tiny, unnatural flash of deep brown against the blinding white. Josiah raised the glass again, his thumb adjusting the focus ring. A mile down, where the goat path snaked out of the timber, a horse pushed through a chest-high drift. Then another. Then a third. 3 riders. They were wearing heavy dusters, their horses plunging violently through the powder. They weren't tracking footprints. There were none left. They were following the only logical trail up the ridge. They were moving slow, exhausted by the snow. But they were moving. Josiah snapped the spyglass shut. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the thin air. Maeve turned her head. "What is it?" "Company," Josiah said. He turned and walked to the new Winchester, leaning against his saddle. He picked it up, checking the action. The brass cartridge shone dull in the morning light. He slid it back into the magazine with a satisfying click. Maeve stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Panic flashed across her face, raw and unfiltered. "Silas's men?" "Doesn't matter who they are," Josiah said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He walked back to the edge of the cave, calculating the distance, the wind, the elevation. "We have to go," Maeve said, her voice rising in pitch, stepping toward him. "We can outrun them. The snow is deep." "Exactly," Josiah cut her off, not looking at her. "The snow is deep. The mules are carrying weight. We try to run up the summit through 3 feet of powder. They'll catch us on the open ridge. Nowhere to hide. Will be target practice." He turned to look at her. His eyes were flat, a pale, icy blue that offered zero comfort. "You don't outrun wolves in the snow, Maeve. You make them bleed for every inch." He knelt at the lip of the overhang. There was a cluster of granite boulders forming a natural parapet overlooking the trail. It was a perfect choke point. The riders would have to file up the narrow path in single file, completely exposed to reach the overhang. Josiah laid the Winchester across the flat top of the rock. He pulled the box of 4440 cartridges from his coat pocket and set it open beside him. "Get behind the mules," Josiah ordered, settling his shoulder against the rifle stock. "Sit down. Cover your ears. Do not stand up until I tell you." Maeve didn't move immediately. She stared at the back of his head, staring at the sheer, casual violence settling into his frame. He wasn't a savior. He was a killer preparing to work. "Josiah," she started. "Go!" he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. She scrambled back into the deepest recess of the cave, pressing herself against the cold stone behind Barnaby. Josiah sighted down the barrel. The wind was light, blowing right to left across the canyon. The sun was at his back, blinding the men below as they looked up. He watched through the iron sights as the first rider emerged from behind a snow-draped pine. The man was bundled in a heavy canvas coat, his rifle resting across his saddle pommel. He was looking at the ground, frustrated by the snow. 400 yards, too far for the Winchester in this wind. Josiah breathed in the freezing air, smelling the sterile tang of ozone and the heavy scent of gun oil on the steel beneath his cheek. He waited. 300 yards. The second rider came into view, shouting something to the first, pointing upward toward the ridge. They had spotted the overhang. 200 yards. Josiah thumbed back the hammer. The metallic click was swallowed by the vast, silent expanse of the mountain. He settled the front post on the chest of the lead rider, letting out half a breath. Just a little closer. 150 yards. Josiah exhaled, holding his breath at the bottom of his lungs. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. A sharp, cracking boom shattered the mountain's silence, rolling down the canyon like a physical weight. A thick plume of gray-white smoke erupted from the muzzle, instantly obscuring Josiah's vision. The smell of sulfur and burnt charcoal bit the inside of his nose. He didn't wait for the smoke to clear. His thick hand racked the lever down and up in a brutal, fluid motion. Brass ejected, spinning onto the shale with a bright tink. Another round fed into the chamber. Down on the trail, the lead horse was screaming. The heavy 4.40 slug had missed the rider's chest as the horse plunged into a drift, striking the animal instead in the heavy muscle of its shoulder. The beast reared up, a massive silhouette of panic against the snow, throwing its rider backward into the powder. The remaining two men didn't freeze. They were valley men, but they weren't green. They spurred their horses off the narrow track, forcing them into the chest-deep drifts among the black pines, seeking the cover of the heavy timber. Crack, crack. Two answering shots echoed up the ridge. The bullets were wild, flying high. One clipped the granite lip of the overhang, showering Josiah's hat with a spray of razor-sharp stone splinters. He ducked, pressing his cheek against the cold rock, tasting dust. "Stay down!" Josiah roared over his shoulder. He peered over the ledge. The man who had been thrown was scrambling on his hands and knees, fighting the deep snow, trying to reach a fallen log. Josiah tracked him, settling the iron sight on the broad expanse of the man's canvas duster. He fired. The shot hit low. The man's leg gave out in an explosion of crimson spray, turning the pristine white snow violently red. He went down screaming, clutching his thigh, thrashing in the powder. But the other two had reached the trees. They dismounted. From the dark gaps between the pines, the heavy, concussive booming of a Sharp's buffalo rifle began. Boom! A heavy slug slammed into the rock face a foot below Josiah's position. The impact was terrifying, a massive transfer of kinetic energy that vibrated through the shale and into Josiah's bones. He shrank back, dragging the Winchester with him. They had him pinned. He had the high ground, but they had cover, and the Sharps could blow a hole straight through a foot of granite. Behind him, Jumper the pack mule began to panic. The continuous gunfire and the smell of blood in the air pushed the animal over the edge. Jumper brayed, a horrible, wet sound, and reared, yanking hard against the reins tied to a rusted piton in the rock. "Josiah!" Maeve screamed. Josiah twisted around. Jumper's iron-shod hooves lashed out, striking the cave wall. If the mule broke loose, it would trample Maeve and bolt straight out onto the exposed trail. Josiah couldn't leave the ledge. If he stopped pinning the men below, they would advance up the slope. "Grab his halter!" Josiah yelled, turning back to the ledge to fire two quick, suppressing shots into the timber. "Blind his eyes!" He didn't look to see if she did it. He couldn't. He levered the rifle again, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline and the bitter cold. The brass casing jammed. "Damn it!" he hissed. The cold had thickened the factory grease in the action. The empty brass was stuck halfway out of the ejection port. He dropped to his knees, pulling his bone-handled knife. He dug the tip of the blade into the hot brass, prying it viciously. Boom! Another sharp's round hit the roof of the overhang. A massive chunk of granite the size of a melon broke loose and crashed onto the cave floor, missing Josiah's leg by inches. Dust choked the air. He finally popped the jammed casing free. It clattered to the floor. He slammed the lever home. He glanced back. Maeve wasn't cowering. She had scrambled forward. She had pulled off the heavy buffalo coat, completely exposing herself to the freezing air, and thrown the massive garment entirely over Jumper's head. The sudden darkness shocked the mule into stillness. Maeve was clinging to the animal's thick neck, her weight dragging its head down, her boots braced against the shale. Her hands, wrapped in the crude cotton bandages, were straining against the leather halter. She was terrified, but she was holding on. Josiah turned back to the cliff edge. He slid the Winchester over the rock. The man with the shattered leg had dragged himself behind a boulder, but the other two were moving. They were flanking, pushing up through the trees on the left side of the ridge, trying to get an angle into the cave. Josiah sighted on a gap in the pines. He waited. His lungs burned. His eyes watered from the biting wind. A shadow moved across the gap. Josiah fired, levered, fired again. The heavy thud of a body hitting the snow echoed up the mountain. One of the men in the timber shouted, a ragged, panicked sound. "Carver, Carver, you hit!" Silence. The remaining man was alone now, save for the bleeder behind the rock. And the silence of the mountain was creeping back in, heavy and oppressive. Josiah didn't move. He kept the rifle leveled on the trees. The wind picked up, whipping a fresh spray of loose snow off the drifts, dusting his face in icy powder. 5 minutes passed. 10. Down in the trees, a horse whinnied. There was the sound of thrashing snow, fading back down the trail toward the valley. The survivor was running. Josiah waited another full 10 minutes, ignoring the burning ache in his thighs and the numbing cold in his fingers. Only when the silence became absolute did he lower the rifle's hammer. He sat back on his heels, letting out a long, ragged breath. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of pulverized rock and burnt powder clinging to his sweat-slicked skin. He stood up, turning toward the back of the cave. Maeve was still holding the mule, the coat draped over its head. She looked at him, her chest heaving. The cold had leached all the color from her face, leaving her lips a bruised purple. "They gone?" she croaked. "For now," Josiah said. He walked over to her. He didn't offer a word of praise. He didn't smile. He reached out and took Jumper's halter from her trembling, bandaged hands. "Pull the coat off him. Put it on. We're moving." The climb above the overhang was brutal. They were out of the timber now, exposed entirely to the howling wind off the summit. The air was thin, tasting of ozone and ice. Every step through the deep powder required a massive exertion of force. Josiah broke the trail, leaning heavily into the wind. His buffalo coat was heavy with accumulated snow. Behind him, Barnaby plodded along, with Maeve hunched in the saddle, clinging to the pommel. Josiah's left arm was throbbing. During the fight, a splinter of granite, shrapnel from the Sharp's rifle impact, had sliced through his heavy coat and bitten deep into the meat of his upper shoulder. In the adrenaline of the firefight, he had barely felt it. Now the cold was magnifying the pain, a deep, burning ache that radiated down into his fingers. He could feel the slow, warm trickle of blood soaking into his canvas shirt, freezing as it hit the outer edges of the wool. He didn't stop. Stopping meant freezing. They marched for 3 hours. The sun moved across the pale sky, offering blinding light but absolutely zero heat. The mountain peaks around them were a jagged, chaotic sea of white and grey rock. Finally, the incline leveled out into a high, narrow plateau, flanked by towering granite spires. Josiah halted. He leaned against his mule, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, white puffs. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting a sudden wave of dizziness. Blood loss and altitude were a deadly combination. He heard the squeak of leather behind him. Maeve had slid out of the saddle. She waded through the snow toward him. The oversized coat dragged in the powder behind her. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. It was a statement of grim fact. Josiah opened his eyes. He looked down at his left side. A dark, frozen slick of blood had stained the side of his coat, nearly black against the brown hide. "Rock splinter," Josiah grunted. He tried to move his left arm to reach into his saddlebag, but the muscle seized, sending a sickening jolt of pain through his neck. He winced, sucking in a sharp breath through his teeth. Maeve didn't ask for permission. She stepped up to him, pushing his good hand away. "Sit down," she ordered. Josiah looked at her. Her eyes were hard. The terror from the trading post and the cave was gone, replaced by the hollow, pragmatic stare of someone who had accepted that death was sitting on their shoulder. Josiah didn't argue. He let his legs give way, sitting heavily on a flat boulder protruding from the snow. Maeve stood over him. She reached for the heavy bone buttons of his coat. Her hands were clumsy, the bandages on her wrists thick and greasy, but she worked them loose. She pulled the heavy hide off his left shoulder, then unbuttoned his canvas shirt, pulling the fabric back to expose the wound. The cut was 3 inches long and jagged, torn open by the sharp stone. It was ugly, seeping dark blood that steamed faintly in the freezing air. Maeve hissed through her teeth. "It's deep. You have any carbolic? Whiskey?" "No," Josiah said, his teeth chattering slightly as the wind hit his bare skin. In the left saddlebag, pouch, more of that grease, and a clean shirt. "Tear it." Maeve waded to the mule. She found the pouch and the shirt. She returned, kneeling in the snow beside him. She used her teeth to start a tear in the flannel shirt, ripping it into long strips with her bandaged hands. "This is going to burn," she said, her voice dropping. "Just do it," Josiah growled, looking away, staring out over the vast, empty expanse of the valley miles below. Maeve scooped the axle grease with 2 fingers and pressed it directly into the open wound. Josiah's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural groan tore from his throat. His right hand clamped onto the edge of the boulder, his knuckles turning pure white. The grease was freezing cold, but hitting the raw nerves felt like a branding iron. Maeve didn't flinch. She worked quickly, her hands moving with a desperate efficiency. She wrapped the strips of flannel tightly around his shoulder, pulling it under his armpit and across his chest to lock the crude dressing in place. She tied it off with a hard, unyielding knot. "Done," she whispered, falling back on her heels. Josiah sat there for a long moment, breathing heavily, letting the searing pain recede into a dull, manageable throb. He pulled his canvas shirt up and hauled the heavy coat back over his shoulder. He looked at her. She was kneeling in the snow, her breath pluming white, staring at her own bandaged hands. They were smeared with his blood and the yellow grease. "You saved the mule," Josiah said quietly. The wind tried to snatch the words away, but they carried. Maeve looked up. Her expression was guarded. "If he bolted, you would have stopped shooting. We would be dead." "Maybe," Josiah conceded. He reached out with his good arm and grabbed the reins of his mule. He used the leather to haul himself to his feet. His knees trembled, but they held. "Cabin is 2 miles, over the ridge." He didn't wait for her to mount up. He turned and started walking, leaning heavily on the mule. Maeve watched his broad back for a moment. He wasn't a hero. He was a rough, violent man who smelled of death and pine pitch. But as she stood up and reached for Barnaby's reins, she realized something profound. In the valley, men smiled at her, spoke softly, and sold her into hell. Up here on the mountain, This brutal man hadn't offered her a single kind word, but he had bled for her. She pulled herself into the saddle, and for the first time since the men broke her husband's door down, she didn't feel like a piece of cargo. The cabin wasn't much more than a pile of logs, hugging the side of a granite cliff. It was built low to the ground to avoid the wind, the roof covered in a thick layer of sod that was currently buried under 3 feet of snow. The only signs it existed were the square angles of the timber and the black iron stovepipe poking through the crust. It was dusk when they arrived. The sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple, and the temperature had plummeted to a lethal degree. Josiah didn't bother tying the mules to the rail. He led them straight to a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, kicking aside the snow to reveal a stack of dry hay he'd cut in the summer. He waded to the cabin door, using his good arm to shovel the drift away with a flat piece of pine board. He kicked the heavy door open. The air inside was stale, smelling of cold ash, dry rot, and old leather. It was colder inside than out, entirely devoid of sunlight. "Get in," Josiah said, his voice a hoarse whisper. His energy was entirely spent. His face was the color of slate. Maeve stumbled through the doorway. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her teeth chattering so violently she couldn't speak. Josiah moved in behind her, shoving the heavy door shut and dropping the iron bar into place. The sudden darkness was absolute. "Stand still," Josiah commanded blindly. He shuffled across the wooden floor, guided by memory. He found the tin matchbox on the heavy oak table. He struck a match. The flare of yellow light illuminated the single room. It was stark. A cast-iron stove in the center, a narrow cot against the far wall piled with furs, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tin cans and ammunition. Josiah lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a beam. The soft yellow glow pushed the shadows into the corners. He didn't stop moving. He went to the stove, opened the iron door, and grabbed a handful of dried moss and kindling from a basket. He built the fire with mechanical, desperate speed. Within minutes, the stovepipe began to tick and ping as the iron heated. Josiah dragged one of the wooden chairs directly in front of the stove. He looked at Maeve. She was standing in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, swaying slightly. "Sit," he told her. She walked over and collapsed into the chair. She leaned forward, holding her bandaged hands out toward the growing heat of the black iron. Josiah walked to the cot and grabbed a massive, heavy blanket made of stitched wolf pelts. He threw it over her shoulders. Then, his legs finally giving out, he sat heavily on the floor beside the stove, leaning his back against the rough logs of the wall. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the howling of the wind, tearing at the roof, and the comforting, rhythmic crackle of the wood in the stove. Slowly, the brutal cold began to retreat. The cabin warmed up. The smell of the wolf pelts, the wood smoke, and the kerosene mingled into something that smelled sharply of survival. As the feeling returned to Maeve's limbs, the pain arrived. Her wrists throbbed fiercely, and her toes burned with the onset of chilblains. She winced, pulling her boots away from the direct heat of the iron. She looked down at Josiah. He had his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow but steady. The bandage under his coat was dark with dried blood, but the bleeding seemed to have stopped. He looked older in the lantern light, the deep lines around his eyes and mouth etched with exhaustion. "Josiah," she said softly. He didn't open his eyes. "Yeah, are they going to come up here?" "No," Josiah said. "Not until the spring thaw. The pass is snowed in behind us. Any man tries to push horses up that ridge now will die in the drifts." "And in the spring?" she asked. Josiah opened his eyes. He looked up at her. The pale blue of his irises reflected the orange glow of the stove grate. "In the spring, we'll see," he said simply. He didn't offer false promises of a new life in California. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. He offered the only truth the mountain allowed. They were alive today. Maeve stared at him, absorbing the blunt honesty of his words. She reached up and pulled the heavy wolf fur tighter around her shoulders. She realized, with a strange, quiet sense of clarity, that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Those civilized men in the valley had broken her, traded her, and left her to die. This wild, violent man had bled for her and brought her to the fire. "I don't know how to trap beaver," she said, her voice finding a steady rhythm in the quiet cabin, "or skin them, but I can cook, and I can mend." Josiah studied her face. He saw the bruising on her cheek, the exhaustion carving hollows under her eyes, and beneath it all, a hard, unyielding core of steel that the valley men had completely failed to recognize. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Josiah's grim expression. It wasn't a smile, but the hard edges of his jaw softened. He slowly pushed himself up off the floor, grunting as his shoulder protested. He walked to the shelves, grabbed a tin of beans and the slab of salt pork he'd bought at Hiram's, and brought them back to the stove. He set the tin on the iron top and pulled his knife, beginning to slice the pork. "I like my coffee strong enough to strip paint," Josiah said, not looking at her, focused on the blade. "And I don't talk much." Maeve let out a small, tired breath. The corners of her mouth twitched upward, a fragile, exhausted expression of relief. "I can live with that," she said. Outside, the blizzard hammered against the log walls, burying the cabin deeper into the mountain, sealing them away from the valley, the debt, and the blood. Inside, the fire burned bright, casting long, steady shadows across the floorboards. Two broken people, stranded at the top of the world, quietly preparing to weather the storm. The mountain offers no mercy, but in its brutal isolation, two broken souls found something the civilized world couldn't provide: safety and a fragile, unyielding trust. As the snow buries the past, Josiah and Maeve must learn to survive the winter and each other. Will the spring thaw bring a new beginning, or will the valley men return to collect their bloody debt? If this grounded, gritty tale of Western survival kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share the story, and subscribe for more raw Western dramas. Drop a comment below. Should they run in the spring or stay and fight?